The mountain twin witches who became their father's lovers. That's the legend they whispered in 1872. In the deep Missouri Ozarks, the town of Redemption Hollow still tells the story of Elspeth and Maeve Arnett, wild, ungodly creatures who used dark magic to seduce their own father. Both got pregnant. Both forced him into sin again and again. The God-fearing community delivered horrible justice to cleanse their town of evil. But 30 years later, when a doctor arrived from the city, he found something that shattered everything. Hidden letters, a father's secret diary, words that painted a completely different picture. The real story wasn't about witches or seduction. It was about two terrified girls and one man's twisted scripture. An entire town had buried the truth so deep they convinced themselves of their own lie. The horrible justice wasn't served to monsters, it was served to victims. What really happened in that isolated cabin, and how far will a community go to protect their darkest secret? The train wheezed to a stop at Redemption Hollow on a gray October morning in 1905, and Dr. Alistair Finch stepped onto the weathered platform with the distinct feeling he had traveled not merely across Missouri, but backward through time itself. The air hung thick with the scent of wood smoke and something else he couldn't quite place, something that seemed to cling to the mountains like a shroud. Behind him, the locomotive's whistle echoed off the limestone bluffs before fading into an oppressive silence that felt almost sacred in its weight. The town spread before him in neat, austere rows, every building painted white or left to weather gray, as if color itself might be construed as vanity. Church spires punctured the skyline at intervals that seemed mathematically precise, and even from the train platform, Alistair could see the crosses that adorned nearly every visible structure. He had come to take over the medical practice of Dr. Ezekiel Morse, who had served these people for 43 years before succumbing to the consumption that had slowly hollowed him from within. The letters of correspondence had been formal, stilted, filled with references to God's will and divine providence that had made Alistair wonder if he was entering a medical practice or a monastery. Within hours of his arrival, he understood that the distinction was meaningless in Redemption Hollow. The townspeople moved through their daily routines with the measured solemnity of pilgrims, their conversations peppered with scripture, and their eyes holding a watchfulness that suggested they were perpetually aware of being observed, if not by their neighbors, then by a higher authority that demanded constant accountability. Children walked in straight lines beside their parents, their laughter muted and infrequent. Women kept their gazes lowered and their sleeves long, even in the unseasonable warmth of the afternoon. Men spoke in hushed tones and removed their hats with ritualistic precision whenever they passed a church, which seemed to happen every few blocks. It was Reverend Davies who first told him the story, 3 days after Alistair had settled into the small house that adjoined his new practice. The preacher had arrived unannounced, his black coat immaculate despite the dust that seemed to coat everything else in the hollow. He carried himself with the bearing of a man accustomed to being the final word on any subject, his pale eyes holding a certainty that Alistair found both impressive and unsettling. "You'll hear talk," Davies said without preamble, settling into the lone chair in Alistair's sparse parlor, "about the Arnett business. Best you hear it proper-like, from someone who knows the truth of it." He folded his hands with deliberate care, and Alistair noticed how the man's fingers bore no calluses, no signs of any labor beyond turning the pages of holy books. Back in 1872, this town was nearly destroyed by evil, pure evil, dressed up in the forms of 2 young women. The tale that followed was delivered with the practiced cadence of a sermon, each detail polished smooth by countless retellings. Elspeth and Maeve Arnett, twin daughters of the godly Josiah Arnett, had been corrupted by forces beyond Christian understanding. They had used witchcraft, dark arts, learned from some unholy source, to seduce their own father, driving him to madness and sin through their wicked coercion. Both had become pregnant by him, bearing his children through their demonic influence. The community, faced with such an abomination, had been forced to deliver a horrible justice to cleanse their town of the evil that had taken root in their midst. It serves as a reminder, Davies concluded, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, of what happens when we let our guard down against the devil's work, why we must be ever vigilant against corruption in all its forms. His eyes fixed on Alistair with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. The Arnett name is not spoken lightly here, Doctor. It reminds us all of the price of ungodliness. Alistair had nodded politely, made appropriate sounds of understanding, and seen the Reverend to the door with promises to keep the town's history in mind. But privately, he dismissed the tale as the sort of backwood superstition that flourished in isolated communities, where ignorance bred fear and fear bred stories that grew more fantastic with each telling. He was a man of science, trained at Washington University, and he had seen enough genuine horror in the charity wards of St. Louis to know that real evil rarely needed supernatural explanation. His dismissal lasted exactly 11 days, until Goody Miller began to die. She was brought to him on a Thursday evening, her ancient body racked with fever and her breathing shallow as paper. The women who carried her spoke in whispers about her age. Some claimed she was 90, others insisted she had passed the century mark years ago. But her mind, when the fever briefly released its grip, remained sharp as winter air. She had been the town's midwife for longer than anyone could remember, her gnarled hands having guided hundreds of souls into the world and, on more occasions than most cared to recall, eased their passage out of it. For 2 days she lingered between this world and whatever lay beyond, occasionally surfacing from her delirium to speak in fragments that made little sense to the women who tended her. But on Saturday night, when Alistair sat alone beside her bed, checking her pulse in the lamplight, her eyes opened with sudden, startling clarity. "They wasn't witches," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of decades. Her fingers, skeletal and cold, clutched at his sleeve with surprising strength. "They was just girls, afraid of him, so afraid." Her breath rattled in her chest, and for a moment Alistair thought she had slipped away, but then her eyes focused on his face with desperate intensity. "The babies? I delivered the babies, sweet little things. They never had a chance to draw breath in this world, but they was perfect. Perfect and innocent, and—" The words dissolved into a coughing fit that brought blood to her lips, and she never spoke again. She died as the sun rose on Sunday morning, and Alistair found himself standing beside her bed, feeling inexplicably unsettled. Her final words circled in his mind like carrion birds, their meaning just beyond his grasp. It was only when he began sorting through her meager possessions, a task that fell to him in the absence of any living relatives, that he discovered the journal. It was a slim volume, its leather binding cracked and stained, tucked beneath a loose floorboard in her tiny cabin. Most of the entries were routine notations about births and deaths, remedies and treatments recorded in a spidery hand that had grown more unsteady with the passing years. But one entry, dated October 15, 1872, stopped him cold. The writing was different here, hurried, desperate, as if the words had been torn from some deep place of anguish. "The Arnett girls came to me today," it read. "Not witches, as the town would have it, but broken children suffering from a malady of the spirit brought on by their father's crushing righteousness. They spoke of things no daughters should know, bore marks no father should leave. I fear for them, but what voice does an old woman carry against a man wrapped in Scripture like armor? God forgive us all for what we choose not to see." Alistair read the passage 3 times before the full weight of its implications settled upon him like a shroud. The official legend of Redemption Hollow, the cautionary tale that maintained the town's rigid moral order, was built upon a lie. And somewhere in the silence that followed this revelation, he heard the whisper of a question that would change everything. If the town had been wrong about the girls, what else had they chosen not to see? The seed of doubt that Goody Miller's journal had planted in Alistair's mind took root with the persistence of a weed, growing stronger with each passing day until it consumed nearly every waking thought. He found himself studying the faces of the townspeople during his rounds, searching for tells, the downcast eyes, the hurried steps past certain corners, the way conversations died when he entered a room. What had they chosen not to see? The question followed him like a shadow, and he began to understand that his peace of mind would remain fractured until he found an answer. His inquiries began subtly enough. During house calls, he would steer conversations toward the town's history, asking casual questions about the old families, the way things used to be. But Redemption Hollow's residents possessed an almost supernatural ability to deflect such discussions, their responses sliding away from anything substantial like water off oiled leather. The Arnett name, when mentioned at all, was spoken in hushed tones, followed by immediate changes of subject, as if the very syllables carried contagion. It was during a consultation with Mrs. Pettigrew, a severe woman whose chronic headaches seemed to worsen whenever she encountered anything that challenged her rigid worldview, that Alistair learned of Josiah Arnett's earthly remains. She had been complaining about the dampness in the church basement affecting her rheumatism when she mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that it was where they stored the belongings of the departed who had no kin to claim them. "Moldering away down there for decades," she sniffed, adjusting her black shawl with sharp, efficient movements. "The Reverend's always meaning to clear it out, but somehow never gets around to it. Says it's not Christian to disturb the dead's possessions without proper cause." Her pale eyes fixed on Alistair with sudden interest. "Why do you ask, Doctor? Surely a man of science has no use for the relics of the departed." But Alistair had already stopped listening. His mind raced with possibilities, and by the time he bid Mrs. Pettigrew good day, he had formulated a plan that would either satisfy his curiosity or damn him as surely as if he had desecrated a grave. Convincing Reverend Davies required more delicacy than Alistair had anticipated. The preacher received him in his study 3 days later, surrounded by theological volumes and religious artifacts that seemed to watch from every shadow. Davies listened with growing suspicion as Alistair explained his interest in the town's history, his desire to understand the community he now served, his scholarly curiosity about the social dynamics that had shaped Redemption Hollow. "Historical interest," Davies repeated, his voice carrying the flat skepticism of a judge questioning a criminal's alibi. "And what, precisely, do you hope to learn from dusty relics that wasn't adequately conveyed in our previous conversation?" Alistair chose his words with surgical precision. "I find that understanding the complete context of a community's formative experiences helps me better serve its medical needs. Trauma, Reverend, whether individual or collective, often manifests in ways that extend far beyond the original incident. If I'm to treat these people effectively, I need to understand what shapes their fears, their silences, their resistances." It was masterfully done, the appeal to his pastoral duties, the suggestion that Alistair's investigation might somehow serve the spiritual well-being of the congregation. Davies studied him for long moments, his pale eyes searching for deception, but Alistair maintained the detached professional demeanor that had served him well in medical school when facing skeptical professors. "Very well," Davies said finally, though his tone suggested he was granting permission for something distasteful but necessary. "But you'll not remove anything from the premises, and you'll conduct your research with appropriate reverence for the departed. Josiah Arnett was a godly man who suffered greatly before his death. Whatever your modern medical theories might suggest, his tragedy deserves respect." The church basement smelled of must and neglect, its stone walls weeping moisture that had claimed countless forgotten possessions over the decades. Wooden crates lined the walls like sarcophagi, each bearing the name of the deceased whose worldly goods lay within. Arnett's crate sat in a far corner, its contents visible through gaps in the warped planking. Inside, Alistair glimpsed the detritus of a life: rotting clothes, a water-stained Bible, a few personal effects that had meant something to someone once upon a time. But it was the leather-bound journal wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of the crate. That made his hands tremble as he lifted it into the lamplight. The binding bore Josiah Arnett's name in faded gold letters, and as Alistair opened it, he felt as though he were peering directly into the soul of a dead man. What he found there destroyed every assumption he had made about the Arnett tragedy and replaced them with a horror so complete that he had to stop reading 3 times to step outside and breathe the clean mountain air. This was not the confession of a bewitched victim, but the narcissistic ravings of a predator who had wrapped his perversions in Scripture so thoroughly that he had convinced himself of his own righteousness. The entries began innocuously enough: prayers, Scripture verses, meditations on faith and duty, but as the months progressed, a darker theme emerged. Josiah wrote of his daughters' womanly corruption, their tempting forms that tested his holy resolve. He detailed his methods of discipline designed to purge the sin from his own bloodline, describing isolation techniques and spiritual corrections that chilled Alistair's blood. The language was deliberately oblique, wrapped in biblical metaphor, but the meaning was unmistakable to anyone with medical training. "The Lord tests me greatly through these vessels of temptation," one entry read, "but I shall not fail in my duty to cleanse them of their inherited wickedness. As Abraham was willing to sacrifice Isaac, so must I be willing to sacrifice my comfort for their salvation. The flesh is weak, but the Spirit must prevail, even when the Spirit requires difficult ministrations." Another entry, dated just weeks before the twins' deaths, was even more explicit in its twisted theology. "They resist my guidance, these daughters of Eve, but resistance itself proves the depth of their corruption. I have prayed for strength to continue my holy work, to break their wills as one breaks a wild horse. The babies they carry are proof of their sin, but also of God's mysterious plan. Through suffering comes redemption, and I am the instrument of that redemption." Alistair closed the journal with hands that shook so violently he nearly dropped it. The truth was not merely different from the town's legend, it was its perfect inversion. Josiah Arnett had not been the victim of his daughter's witchcraft. He had been their tormentor, their rapist, the architect of their destruction. The pregnancies had not resulted from seduction, but from sustained abuse. The twins had not been evil temptresses, but terrified children trapped by a monster who used God's name to justify his crimes. And the town, the entire community of Redemption Hollow, had chosen to believe the lie rather than confront the truth. They had crafted a mythology that transformed victims into villains and elevated a predator to the status of martyr. The horrible justice they had delivered had not cleansed evil from their midst. It had protected evil by destroying its evidence. Alistair stood in that moldering basement, surrounded by the forgotten possessions of the dead, and felt the weight of 33 years of willful blindness settling on his shoulders like a mantle of lead. He was standing on a crime scene, he realized, not just the original crime of Josiah's abuse, but the ongoing crime of the town's silence. Every day that passed without acknowledgement of the truth was another day of injustice, another betrayal of 2 girls who had died believing the whole world thought them monsters. The pursuit of truth, he understood now, would exact a price that might destroy him as surely as it had destroyed Elspeth and Maeve Arnett. But as he rewrapped the journal and placed it back in its hiding place, he knew with crystalline certainty that some truths were worth dying for. The only question was whether he possessed the courage to pay what such truth would cost. The transformation in Redemption Hollow's attitude toward its new physician began gradually, like the first whispers of rot in seemingly healthy fruit. What had once been cautious courtesy curdled into something colder, more watchful, as word spread through the tight-knit community that Dr. Finch was asking questions about things that decent folk left buried. It started with canceled appointments, sudden recoveries from ailments that had plagued patients for weeks, urgent family obligations that required immediate attention, mysterious improvements in conditions that had previously demanded regular medical intervention. Within a fortnight of his visit to the church basement, Alistair's appointment book had thinned to barely a handful of patients per week, and even those who came did so with the furtive air of sinners seeking absolution. The shift was most pronounced in Reverend Davies, whose demeanor toward Alistair underwent a metamorphosis so complete it might have been supernatural. Where once the preacher had shown professional courtesy tinged with pastoral concern, now there was only a brittle formality that cracked like winter ice whenever Alistair attempted to probe deeper into the town's history. When Alistair finally worked up the courage to confront Davies directly about the diary, the encounter left no doubt about where the battle lines had been drawn. "I've been thinking about our previous conversation," Alistair began, settling into the same chair in Davies' study where he had first heard the legend of the Arnett twins. "About the events of 1872. I wonder if you might help me understand some inconsistencies I've encountered in my research." Davies set down his pen with deliberate precision, his pale eyes taking on the quality of winter sky before a storm. "Inconsistencies, Doctor? I'm afraid I don't understand what you mean. The events of that terrible time are well documented and thoroughly understood by this community. Perhaps your research has led you astray." "I found some documents," Alistair pressed on, though every instinct warned him to retreat. "Personal writings that suggest the official account might not capture the complete truth of what happened. Have you ever considered that the twins might not have been the instigators of—" "Stop." The word cracked through the air like a whip, and Davies rose from behind his desk with a movement so sharp it sent papers scattering. "Whatever documents you believe you found, whatever theories your medical training has led you to construct, I warn you against pursuing this line of inquiry further. Some sorrows are settled, Doctor. Some wounds are healed by the grace of God and the wisdom of those who came before us. To tear them open again serves no purpose but to invite evil back into our midst." The threat was veiled but unmistakable, wrapped in religious language, but carrying the weight of temporal authority. Davies moved to his window, gazing out at the town that spread below his church like a flock under his protection. "You are an outsider here, Dr. Finch. Your medical knowledge is welcomed, but your understanding of our community's spiritual needs is limited. I strongly advise you to focus on healing the living rather than disturbing the dead." The meeting ended with Davies showing him to the door with the sort of cold politeness reserved for unwelcome visitors, and Alistair walked home through streets where people crossed to avoid him, where conversations died at his approach, where children were hurried past his office as if proximity to him might prove contagious. He had become a pariah in a matter of days, the outsider who refused to accept the comfortable lies that held their world together. But even in a conspiracy of silence, cracks inevitably appear, and it was through one such fissure that Martha Henley finally approached him. She came to his office on a Tuesday evening when the November wind howled down from the mountains, like a choir of the damned, slipping through his door so quietly he might have thought her a ghost, if not for the way she clutched her worn shawl against the cold. Martha was older than the hills themselves, her face a road map of sorrows that stretched back to the early days of Redemption Hollow. She had been a recluse for as long as anyone could remember, living alone in a cabin that perched on the mountainside like a bird's nest, venturing into town only for supplies and Sunday services. Her eyes held the haunted quality of someone who had seen too much and spoken too little, and when she finally broke her silence, her words came out in a rush, as if a dam had burst inside her chest. "I knew them," she whispered, settling into the chair across from Alistair's desk, like a sparrow prepared for flight. Elspeth and Maeve, before he took them away from the world, before he made them into ghosts in their own lives. I knew them. Her hands trembled as she spoke, arthritic fingers picking at the worn fabric of her shawl. They wasn't witches, Doctor. They was just girls who laughed too loud and asked too many questions and made their father angry with their aliveness. She told him of the twins as children, bright and curious, and full of the sort of energy that made other children gravitate toward them like flowers, turning toward the sun. Elspeth had been the bolder of the two, quick to laugh and quicker still to defend her sister from any slight, real or imagined. Maeve had been gentler, dreamy, given to wandering off into the woods to gather flowers or study the patterns of birds in flight. They had been Martha's playmates before Josiah decided that the outside world posed too great a threat to their spiritual development. He started keeping them home from school when they was maybe 12, 13 years old, Martha continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Said the other children was corrupting them, filling their heads with worldly ideas. We'd see them sometimes, watching from their cabin windows when we played in the meadow, but they wasn't allowed to join us no more, like caged birds they was. Beautiful, bright caged birds. The true horror, Martha revealed, was that the town had known. Not the details, perhaps, but enough. Enough to recognize that Josiah Arnett's righteousness had a cruel edge, that his daughter's increasing isolation was unnatural, that the bruises occasionally visible on their arms and faces told a story no one wanted to read. But Josiah was a pillar of the community, a man whose biblical knowledge was matched only by his financial contributions to the church, and it was easier to look away than to confront the possibility that evil could wear such a godly mask. I should have said something, Martha's voice cracked with decades of suppressed guilt. Should have gone to the sheriff, to the preacher, to somebody. But I was just a girl myself, and who would have believed me against a man like Josiah Arnett? So I kept quiet, and they died thinking the whole world believed them monsters. It was then that Martha provided the key that would unlock the final truth. She told Alistair about Elspeth's secret hiding place, revealed in whispered confidence during one of their last conversations, before Josiah severed the twins' connection to the outside world entirely. Beneath a loose floorboard in their cabin, Elspeth had hidden a small tin box containing her most precious possessions, letters, she had said, written to someone who could never receive them, but who might understand. The cabin's still there, Martha said, rising to leave with the same ghostly quietness with which she had arrived. At the edge of town, where the woods start climbing toward the ridge. Nobody goes there now, they say it's cursed, but if you want the truth, Doctor, that's where you'll find it. Just be careful. This town has kept its secrets for 33 years, and it won't give them up easy. As if to underscore Martha's warning, Sheriff Cornelius Wade appeared at Alistair's door the very next evening. Wade was a large man who wore his authority like ill-fitting clothes, his bulk filling the doorframe as he removed his hat with exaggerated courtesy. His visit was brief, ostensibly social, filled with pleasantries about how the doctor was settling in, whether he needed anything to make his transition to small-town life more comfortable. "Course, small towns can be funny places," Wade said, as he prepared to leave, his words carrying the weight of casual menace. "Full of old stories, old grievances, old ways of doing things. Sometimes outsiders get confused, think they understand things they don't really grasp. That can lead to misunderstandings, unpleasantness. Be a shame if a fine physician like yourself found himself caught up in something unpleasant over old business that's best left buried." He settled his hat back on his head with deliberate care. "Hope we understand each other, Doctor. Redemption Hollow's a peaceful place, and we aim to keep it that way." The threat was crystal clear, wrapped in folksy pleasantries but carrying the unmistakable message that his investigation had been noticed and would not be tolerated much longer. But as Alistair watched the sheriff disappear into the November darkness, he felt not fear, but a strengthening of his resolve. They were afraid of what he might find, which meant there was indeed something to be found. And somewhere in the ruins of the Arnett cabin, two murdered girls were waiting for someone to finally hear their voices. The Arnett cabin crouched at the forest's edge like a wounded animal, its weathered boards gray as bone and its windows dark as the sockets of a skull. 3 decades of neglect had not been kind to the structure. The roof sagged under the weight of fallen branches, the front porch had collapsed into a tangle of rotting timber, and vines had claimed the walls with such thoroughness that the building seemed to be dissolving back into the wilderness from which it had been carved. But it still stood, defiant in its decay, a monument to secrets that time had not been able to bury. Alistair approached it on a moonless December night, his lantern casting wild shadows that danced and writhed across the broken boards. Every step felt like a desecration, every creak of the warped floorboards beneath his feet like a scream that might alert the watching town to his presence. He had waited weeks for the right opportunity, watching the cabin from a distance, learning the patterns of the few hunters and trappers who occasionally passed through the area. Tonight, with snow beginning to fall and the wind howling down from the mountains, he was as alone as any living soul could be in Redemption Hollow. The front door had long since given up any pretense of keeping the world at bay, hanging askew on rusted hinges that groaned like souls in torment when he pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was a mausoleum of abandoned life, furniture covered in dust and mouse droppings, papers scattered and yellowed with age, the detritus of a family that had been torn apart by forces too terrible for the outside world to acknowledge. But it was not the main room that drew his attention. It was the smaller chamber at the back, what had once been the girls' sleeping quarters. Martha's directions proved accurate with the precision of a surveyor's map. The loose floorboard was exactly where she had described it, in the corner near what had once been a window, but was now merely a gaping wound in the wall through which winter wind moaned like a chorus of the damned. The board lifted easily under the pressure of his knife, as if it had been waiting 33 years for this moment, and beneath it lay a space that had been carved with desperate care into the supporting beam below. The tin box was smaller than he had expected, no larger than a prayer book, its surface green with verdigris, but its contents protected by the oil-soaked cloth in which it had been wrapped. Alistair's hands trembled as he lifted it from its hiding place, and for a moment he hesitated, understanding with crystalline clarity that what lay within would either vindicate his growing certainty or destroy it entirely. The choice to open it felt like standing at the edge of a precipice, knowing that the next step would send him tumbling into an abyss from which there might be no return. But the letters inside, 17 of them, written in a hand that began neat and careful, but grew increasingly desperate as the months progressed, left no room for doubt or interpretation. They were addressed to Dearest Mama, though Elspeth's mother had been dead for nearly a decade, and they painted a picture of hell disguised as righteousness that was more horrifying than any nightmare Alistair's medical training had prepared him to confront. The first letter, dated March of 1872, began with a sort of mundane details that might have filled any young woman's correspondence: complaints about the weather, observations about the changing seasons, expressions of loneliness for departed friends. But even in these early pages, darker themes began to emerge. "Papa says we must be more careful about our modesty," Elspeth had written. "He has noticed that we are becoming women, and fears that our forms might tempt others to sin. We are no longer allowed to attend church services or social gatherings, as he believes the corruption of the outside world has already taken root in our hearts." As the letters progressed, the true horror of the twins' situation revealed itself with the inexorable logic of a mathematical proof. Josiah's spiritual guidance became increasingly intimate, his lessons in obedience more physically invasive. The girls were isolated completely from the outside world, told that their very existence was a source of temptation that required constant vigilance and correction. When they resisted, they were beaten. When they complied, they were praised for their submission to God's will as interpreted by their Father. "He comes to our room now every night," one letter revealed, its handwriting so shaky that Alistair had to hold the lantern close to make out the words. He says it is his duty as our spiritual guardian to ensure we understand the nature of sin, that we must experience temptation in order to resist it. Maeve cries afterward, but I tell her we must be strong. Mama, I try to remember your face, your voice, the songs you used to sing, but it gets harder every day. Sometimes I think you are calling to us from whatever place the good go when they die, and I pray that you will take us there soon. The pregnancies had been discovered in late summer, and the girls' terror was palpable in every line. They understood, with the awful clarity that comes from sustained abuse, that their condition would be seen as proof of their wickedness rather than evidence of their father's crimes. They had attempted to run away in early September, traveling on foot through the mountain wilderness toward the nearest town. But they had been caught by Sheriff Thaddeus Wade, Cornelius Wade's predecessor and grandfather, who had returned them to Josiah with promises that their waywardness would be dealt with appropriately. But it was the final letter, written just days before their deaths, that shattered Alistair's understanding of the tragedy completely. In handwriting that was barely legible, Elspeth described the birth of their children, both girls, born within hours of each other, and the terrible council that had convened to determine their fate. Sheriff Wade, Reverend Ezekiel Davies, the current Reverend's grandfather, Judge Morrison, and 3 other town elders had gathered in the Arnett cabin to address what they termed the situation. They did not come to help us, Elspeth had written, her words burning themselves into Alistair's consciousness like brands. They came to protect themselves, to protect the town from scandal. They said we had used witchcraft to corrupt our father, that our children were the spawn of unholy union, that the community could not survive if the truth were known. Sheriff Wade spoke of justice, but not the kind that would see Papa punished for his crimes. The kind that would see us silenced forever, our babies with us, so that Redemption Hollow could continue to believe itself pure. The letter detailed the council's decision with the clinical precision of a court record. The twins would be declared witches who had seduced their father through supernatural means. Their babies would be described as stillborn, corrupted by the evil that had created them. The deaths would be presented as divine justice, a cleansing of evil that had threatened to destroy the community's spiritual foundation. And Josiah, broken by grief and shame over his victimization, would be remembered as a martyr who had suffered nobly under demonic persecution. Tomorrow they will come for us, the letter concluded, and Alistair could almost hear Elspeth's voice across the decades of silence. I do not know what form their justice will take, but I know it will be terrible. I write this letter knowing it may never be found, but hoping that someday someone will know the truth. We were not witches, Mama. We were just your daughters, and we tried to be strong like you taught us. If there is mercy in whatever place the innocent go when they die, please ask God to remember us, not as the monsters they will make us, but as the girls we really were. Alistair sat in that ruined cabin as the snow fell outside, surrounded by the ghosts of murdered innocents, and felt something fundamental break inside his chest. This was not merely the story of one man's corruption, but of an entire community's complicity in evil. The town fathers had not stumbled upon a tragedy. They had orchestrated one, crafting a mythology that would protect their reputations at the cost of 2 young lives. Every Sunday sermon about righteousness, every stern lecture about the dangers of sin, every retelling of the Arnett legend, was built upon the bones of victims whose only crime had been surviving long enough to become inconvenient. The horrible justice had not been divine retribution against evil. It had been murder, sanctioned and celebrated by the very people who claimed to speak for God. And for 33 years, Redemption Hollow had lived with this lie, had built its identity upon it, had used it to terrorize generations of children into compliance with their rigid moral code. The twins had died believing the whole world thought them monsters. never knowing that their real sin had been threatening the comfortable fiction that allowed good people to sleep soundly while evil flourished in their midst. The weight of truth proved heavier than Alistair had ever imagined, and by late December of 1905, it had nearly crushed him entirely. His medical practice had dwindled to nothing more than emergency calls from desperate souls who had exhausted all other options, and even those came with whispered apologies and furtive glances, as if association with him might prove contagious. The town's hostility had crystallized into something palpable, a wall of silence and suspicion that followed him through the streets like a living thing. Children were hurried past his office, conversations died at his approach, and more than once he had found crude symbols chalked on his door, warnings that even an outsider could interpret. The isolation gnawed at him with relentless persistence. He had discovered a truth that demanded acknowledgement, but he possessed no means of forcing that acknowledgement from a community that had spent 33 years perfecting the art of willful blindness. Legal justice was impossible. The perpetrators were long dead, the witnesses complicit, the evidence dismissed as the ravings of condemned witches. He found himself questioning his own sanity, wondering if the enormity of what he had uncovered was driving him toward the same madness that had once been attributed to Josiah Arnett. The letters seemed to mock him from their hiding place in his desk drawer, their desperate pleas for vindication echoing in his mind, like the voices of the damned. It was during his lowest moment, when he had all but decided to abandon Redemption Hollow and return to the anonymous safety of St. Louis, that Martha's final gift reached him. She came to his office on a bitter January morning, moving with the ethereal quality of a woman who no longer fully belonged to the world of the living. Her message was delivered in whispers, another piece of the puzzle that she had carried in silence for decades. "There's a place," she said, her ancient hands trembling as she drew a crude map on a scrap of paper. "In the woods past the old logging road. 2 little graves, unmarked, forgotten. The babies, they buried them like animals, away from consecrated ground. Said they couldn't rest in the same earth as Christian folk." Her eyes held the hollow quality of someone confessing a sin that had eaten away at her soul. "I followed them that night, watched from the trees. Somebody should know where they lie." The graves were exactly where Martha had indicated, 2 small depressions in the frozen earth, marked only by stones that time and weather had shifted into meaningless arrangements. Standing there in the winter silence, surrounded by the skeletal remains of trees that had witnessed unspeakable acts, Alistair felt something shift inside his chest. The despair that had paralyzed him for weeks began to transform into something harder, more purposeful. He could not bring the girls back, could not undo 33 years of injustice, but he could ensure that their children, murdered as surely as their mothers, were finally acknowledged as human beings who had deserved better than unmarked graves in unhallowed ground. Using wood from a fallen oak and tools borrowed from his medical bag, he carved 2 simple crosses, giving the nameless infants the dignity their killers had denied them. Mary Elspeth and Mary Maeve, he christened them silently, honoring both their mothers and the grandmother they would never know. The act was small, private, witnessed only by the watching trees, but it kindled something in his spirit that had been nearly extinguished by despair. This was how justice would be served, not through courts or laws, but through the simple act of bearing witness, of refusing to let the innocent be forgotten. His renewed determination caught the attention of Eleanor Morrison, the schoolteacher whose grandfather had been Sheriff Wade's deputy during the events of 1872. She approached him on a gray February afternoon, her manner suggesting someone struggling with a burden too heavy to carry alone. Eleanor possessed the quiet dignity of a woman who had built her life on principles that were now being tested by terrible knowledge, and when she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of generational guilt. "My grandfather left some things," she said, producing a small wooden lockbox that she handled as if it contained something poisonous. papers he couldn't bring himself to destroy, but couldn't bear to keep where they might be found. I've carried his shame my whole life, Dr. Finch, but I never understood its full weight until now. Inside the box lay documents that provided the final pieces of the puzzle, a confession signed by both twins, admitting to the practice of witchcraft and the seduction of their father, alongside Sheriff Wade's private notes expressing his deep unease about the proceedings. The confession was clearly coerced, its language stilted and unnatural, bearing no resemblance to the raw honesty of Elspeth's letters. But Wade's notes told a different story entirely. "The girls seem more terrified than evil," he had written. "Their father's behavior troubles me greatly, but the town elders insist this is the only way to preserve our community's good name. God forgive me, I fear we are about to commit a sin that will stain us all." The final entry, dated the day after the twins' execution, was barely legible. "It is done, but I cannot escape the feeling that we have killed the innocent to protect the guilty. May God have mercy on our souls." Armed with this trinity of evidence, Josiah's diary, Elspeth's letters, and Wade's confession of doubt, Alistair knew that the moment of reckoning had arrived. He could not win in a courtroom, could not force legal justice upon the dead, but he could shatter the lie upon which Redemption Hollow had built its identity. On a cold Sunday morning in March of 1906, he walked into Reverend Davies' church during the height of the morning service, carrying with him the documents that would either redeem two murdered girls or destroy him entirely. The congregation fell silent as he approached the pulpit, their faces reflecting everything from curiosity to outright hostility. Davies rose to intercept him, but Alistair's voice cut through the tension with surgical precision. "I have come to speak for the dead," he announced, his words carrying clearly through the suddenly electric air. "For Elspeth and Maeve Arnett, and for the truth that this community has spent 33 years burying." What followed was not a sermon, but an exorcism, as Alistair read from the documents in a calm, steady voice that never wavered despite the growing chaos around him. He recited passages from Josiah's diary that revealed the true nature of his spiritual guidance, excerpts from Elspeth's letters that painted their terror in stark, undeniable terms, and Sheriff Wade's anguished admission that they had executed innocents to protect their own reputations. Some members of the congregation stormed out in furious denial, their exit accompanied by curses and threats. Others remained transfixed, tears streaming down faces that had not known such grief since the day the lie was born. But all of them, believers and deniers alike, had heard the truth spoken aloud at last. The aftermath was swift and merciless. Alistair's remaining patients abandoned him entirely. His practice collapsed overnight, and anonymous threats appeared with increasing frequency on his doorstep. But he had accomplished what he set out to do. The lie was broken, the silence shattered, the comfortable fiction that had allowed good people to sleep soundly while evil flourished finally exposed for what it was. Victory tasted of ash and sorrow, but it was victory nonetheless. When he finally left Redemption Hollow in late April, driving the same road he had traveled with such optimism 8 months earlier, a small group waited for him at the town's edge. Martha, Eleanor, and a handful of others, whose consciences had been awakened by his revelations, stood in silent tribute, their presence more meaningful than any words could have been. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at his new practice in Kansas City, containing a single photograph and a few lines in Eleanor's careful script. "They have proper stones now, Doctor. The whole truth carved in marble, where it can never be erased again. Thank you for giving them back their names.